Good evening, everybody. A very, very welcome to the first European Veritas Forum, which is also online. We're very pleased to have you all here at the online forum. And we don't know where you are, if you're at home or if you are somewhere else, probably at home, sitting on the couch or in a chair, in your comfy clothes, maybe in your pajamas, but maybe also in your business clothes. It doesn't matter, but we're very pleased to have you here. Take some drinks, take some snacks, whenever you feel like it, and join the evening. And we're going to talk about where is God when the world falls apart, and also finding your questions on suffering, faith, and hope. We have two speakers tonight, both from different countries, and I will introduce them more properly later. But very welcome to Stefan Gustavsson from Sweden and Christian Hofreiter from Austria. My name is Frauke van Koeveringen. I'm your moderator tonight, and I'm from the Netherlands. I'll shortly introduce the Veritas Forum for some of you who don't know it. The Veritas Forum invites students and faculty to ask life's hardest questions. And with a commitment to courageous discourse, we put the historic Christian faith in dialogue with other beliefs and invite participants from all backgrounds to pursue truth together. Because Veritas means truth, for some who doesn't know that. When this isn't your first Veritas Forum, you might wonder how to ask questions to the speakers. Normally, we're all together, and then the moderator says who has a question, and people raise their hands. So we have this covered. We have a program this evening, and it works as, we have it covered by Slido. So I just raised this Slido link, and it has a number to attend it as well. And through Slido, you can put your questions that you have for both speakers in there, and we will be answering them later on. So please join also with Slido. It will be also in the chat function, so if you didn't catch the number, look at the chat. Tonight, for sure, we know there will be students from Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Albania, and the Netherlands, and maybe our colleagues from the United States are also watching. And you might not see them, but we're all here enjoying the evening. The program for the evening will be as follows. I will introduce Stefan Gustavsson first. He will give an introduction on the theme, and then there's time for one or two questions. After that, I will introduce Christian Hofreiter, and he will give an introduction on his view on the topic. There will be one or two questions also. And after that, we'll dive into the questions that are asked in Slido. But also, if you have a good question on the introductions, please fill them out. The most asked questions I will ask to them, and you can upvote them as well. Well, it's a long introduction, maybe, but I'm hoping you're enjoying this evening. I would like to also invite Stefan and Christian to say very welcome, and please say hi to everyone.
Hello, everyone. Greetings from Stockholm, Sweden.
Hello, greetings from Vienna, Austria.
Well, I'll take the word back again. Thank you very much. Very, very welcome. We'll see you more later. I will introduce Stefan. He's our first panelist this evening, and he's a Swedish theologian, speaker, and writer. He was previously the General Secretary of the Swedish Evangelical Alliance and is now the Director of Apologia, I hope I say it right, a Center for Christian Apologetics. He often takes part in public conversations about meaning, truth, and the message of the gospel. He has written a number of books, amongst them The Skeptic's Guide to Jesus. Stephen is married to Ingrid, and they make their home in Stockholm. Very welcome, Stefan. Sorry.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be part of this forum and be able to discuss some really important and also difficult issues. The New Testament encourages us to rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. We as Christians, of course, are rejoicing thinking about the resurrection of Christ that we have just celebrated. But we also mourn when we see the tragedy around us these days. The tragedies of lost opportunities, of suffering, and of death. The corona epidemic does actually not raise any new questions. Suffering and injustice, disease and death are constantly destroying human life. The only new thing is the visible scale of it. This reminds me of the words of the English writer William Hazlitt, who has said, "The least pain in our little finger gives us more concern and uneasiness than the destruction of millions of our fellow beings." That is how pathetically self-absorbed we often are. It is first when we are threatened, like we are right now, that we really care. But the fact that we are pathetic does not let God off the hook. And that is, of course, the theme of this evening. Where is God when the world falls apart? So where is God in all this? Let me state it from the start. The Christian faith does not give us an explicit and detailed answer to every pain and tragedy. That's why people in the Bible in so many places are just lamenting and screaming out their questions so loud. Why, God? Where are you, God? Why me? But the Christian faith still provides resources to help us grapple with suffering. And to understand that, let me put the issue in front of us in some perspective. Every one of us have to join our individual life story into a bigger framework, a bigger story about what kind of universe we are a part. Our understanding of pain and suffering will depend upon our worldview. Today, many in the Western world, many around me here in Sweden, they will read their life in the light of a secular worldview, where there is no God and no transcendent reality. But as Chesterton has said, if you regard nature as a mother, you discover that she is a stepmother. And he means, if nature is all there is, then there is no one who ultimately cares. There is no love or compassion or hope. And think about it. The most valued words in a language, words like meaning and love and hope and beauty, they are undermined if at the bottom there is no God, only nature. Nature is like the proverbial evil stepmother. Nature does not care for us. So the secular story does not give us any hope or meaning when thinking of the pandemic. But what happens then if we put our life story into the great drama of the Christian faith instead and start to relate ourselves to a creator God? Well, then you have a very different worldview. The Christian worldview presents a much more complex view of reality. And I like to describe it as a worldview with 4 layers or 4 dimensions. Of course, there is nature, the created realm, which is a world where viruses are a part. It's a part of the biological system. And most viruses are actually beneficial. They are a good part of the system. The problem we are facing now goes back to food markets in China and has a very natural explanation. So you have nature. Then the second layer is the human layer, human responsibility and human actions. And in this case, in terms of the epidemic, human ignorance or maybe human foolishness in dealing with food has made it possible for a dangerous virus to leap over from animals to humans. And then, because of the wonder of a global world, has been kicked all over the earth. And of course, as usual, there was also a cover-up from people in power. So there is a clear human explanation for the problems we are facing. So the corona epidemic has a very natural and a very human explanation, also according to the Christian faith. But according to the Christian faith, there are two more layers, not only the natural and the human. There is the spiritual and the divine layer. The spiritual layer, that is, there are evil spiritual forces. To quote the New Testament, the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. And ultimately, there is a divine dimension. God is there, and he has not left the world. These two levels of the spiritual and of the divine are, according to the Christian faith, equally real as the natural and the human. Now, in light of that, some Christians are quick in proclaiming that the epidemic we are facing is a punishment from God, that God has allowed evil powers to break loose to destroy human life and human culture. So they go directly to the spiritual and divine level. And of course, there can be reasons for God to punish humanity. If Greta Thunberg has the right to judge us, so has God. But the problem with this is that we do not have any insight into these two layers, the spiritual and the divine. And we do not have an explanation from God what this epidemic is all about. That is different from some special cases in the Old Testament when God explained certain events and gave a moral explanation for them. So, because we don't have a continuous information about the spiritual and divine, we as Christians, I think, have to live with unanswered questions about what is going on right now. We just don't know. But one thing is sure, when we face suffering, and now we face it big time as a global human family, that is a wake-up call from God. With the famous words from C.S. Lewis, pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Now, as Christians, we live with these unanswered questions within the broader framework of understanding, because the Christian faith gives us a chronology that helps us to understand the world. We can follow a timeline. So as Christians, we look back to the fall when humans revolted against God and cut themselves loose from their creator. And since then, we are out of sync with our origin, and the world has become a broken place. So as Christians, we have, generally speaking, an explanation for the fact that this world is such a beautiful place because it's a creation from God, and an explanation why it's such a messy place, because we have turned our backs on God. Along this timeline after the fall, there is no law of karma. Jesus was crystal clear when he talked about people being hit by catastrophes. They were not worse sinners than others. And of course, Job in the Old Testament, who faced unimaginable suffering, he is presented as blameless and upright. So we don't believe in the law of karma. Life in this present time after the fall is deeply unjust. But we not only look back to the fall, we also look forward to the renewal of all creation, when all evil will be defeated and all tears wiped away. So we have a real hope. Our present struggle, therefore, is put into a meaningful and hopeful framework when we look back and when we look forward. But there are even more. There are more resources within the Christian faith that can help us handling difficult times, even without having all the answers. In the midst of pain, we as Christians can draw strength from a number of sources. Let me mention 3. We believe in a suffering servant who knows human pain. We believe not in a faraway God elevated about human life, but we believe in a God who has become one of us and who knows human life and human suffering. He can have real compassion with us. Think of Jesus weeping and being deeply moved when confronted with death and decay and sorrow outside the tomb of Lazarus. Secondly, we believe in an invisible presence who gives us strength and is with us. Even if tragedy is not hindered or sorrow is not lifted away from us, the Lord has promised to be with us and give us strength to persevere in the midst of hardship. And thirdly, we believe in an infinite wisdom who promises meaning even when we cannot see any. But we trust that he who is infinite in his wisdom has the ability to turn things upside down. The cross of Christ, with its on the surface meaningless suffering, was turned into a wonderful victory. And that can happen also with our suffering. I was recently given a quote from the English preacher Charles Spurgeon, who said, "God is too good to be unkind, and he's too wise to be mistaken. And when we cannot trace his hand, we must trust his heart." That is so well said. So in the end, it will all come down to this question: is God trustworthy? Can we trust his heart even when we don't understand his dealings with us? The Easter message is the foundation for that trust. It is the cross of Christ and the resurrection of Christ, which is the reason why we can trust him in our own small, fragile life, even when we don't understand all that is happening around us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Stefan. I do have a question for you, and it came from the Slido. So some anonymous is asking, is this COVID-19 virus a sign of God, of his return to Earth? I think it's a little of what you said, but maybe you also talked about the corona. So are you able to give an answer on that?
Is the virus a sign that Jesus is soon to return? I don't know. I know that Jesus will return to Earth. That's a very important part of my faith. So I'm eagerly awaiting the return of Christ, but I don't have a timetable, and we have not been given a virus as a sign specifically for that event. So I think it's not a wise thing to try to determine exactly where in God's timetable we are at the moment. Everyone who has tried to do that so far has failed. And I think there are several passages in the New Testament that actually warns us for doing that. We know that the Lord is on his way back to Earth, but we should focus on more important things than to try to see specific signs. That would be my opinion.
Well, thank you for answering. And also thank you for your introduction. And after we talked our Christian talks, we'll do the questions to both to you. So if you have more questions, please go to Slido and put in the event code. It's also in the chat box, so you can find it over there. Thank you, Stefan. Our second panelist this evening, you have seen him already, is Dr. Christian Hofreiter. He is originally from Tyrol in Austria, and his academic background is in translation studies and later in theology. Over his career, he has worked as a university lecturer in Innsbruck, was an associate in a government relations firm in Washington, D.C., and served as a chaplain to postgraduate students in Oxford, where he also completed a PhD in theology. His research focused on religion and violence and was recently published. Today, he's the director of the Zacharias Institute for Science, Culture and Faith in Vienna, which seeks to help the believer think and help the thinker believe. He joins us tonight from his home in Vienna, where he lives with his wife and their 2 children. Very welcome, Christian.
Hello, thank you, Frauke, for this very kind introduction. Thank you, Stefan, for your very systematic and broad overview of the topic we're considering here today. Where is God when the world is falling apart? And I'm always keen to find out how people who are quite different from myself experience the world, how they make sense of what is going on, what resources they have to bring to the human condition which we all share. And I also love literature. And so since, as probably all of you, I'm not going to the office very much these days, I'm actually doing a bit of reading, not as much as I hoped, because work actually doesn't stop, as many of us are finding out. But I'm doing some reading. And so one book that I've recently read and really enjoyed and found very pertinent is a book that many people are reading these days. It's by one of the great writers of the 20th century, a French author, Nobel Prize laureate. It's Albert Camus, Die Pest in German, The Plague in English, or La Peste in the original French. It was published in 1947, just after the Second World War. Camus wrote it during the 40s, the earlier part of the 40s. And a lot of people are reading it now because it is very directly applicable to the situation in which we find ourselves, because it describes an epidemic. An epidemic in this case, a city, so not a pandemic, but it's in a city, the city of Oran, which is a port city in Algeria, where he grew up, not in Oran, but in Algiers. And one of the ways he describes the situation that makes it so relevant is that it takes you through these stages. There are these first signs, the first questions. Could this really be it? Could this be the plague? It, in fact, is the bubonic plague in that in that story. And there's a lot of denial, and there's well, let's not worry people too early, and then the plague spreads, and then there is panic, and there's a shutdown, and people can't leave the city, people can't enter the city. As a quarantine, actually people can enter the city, but they can't leave after that, and only one person chooses to do so in this story. And then people make sense of this new reality, as all of us are doing these days, making sense of what is going on, how bad will it really be. I saw just today the newspaper says the International Monetary Fund is predicting the worst recessions since 1930. So not very encouraging on the economic front. And of course, the jury is still out how many people will die as a direct or indirect effect of this pandemic. So some of us in Austria, the situation is fairly well under control. We even have reopening of certain shops now. In other places, including very close to us, our neighboring country, Italy, and Spain and France, we've all seen the pictures, we've heard the stories, and it's hard to comprehend that it's happening, and that it's happening so close to us, because we do know, as Stefan said in the introduction, people die, a lot of people die of preventable diseases all the time, malaria, hunger, it's just, the world is full of this, but the scale and the synchronicity really mean everybody stay at home, think about it. And so we do think about it. And that's one of the effects that Camus describes, that people begin to evaluate their lives, they think what is really important to them, they realize how much they miss people who they can now not see because they're not in their city. And I think that's what many of us feel, this feeling, he describes it as a feeling of exile. And it's strange because you're at home, you're in your own living room, and yet you're exiled. because you cannot go where you want to go. You cannot be with the person you want to be with. The Easter holiday, for many of us, a treasured holiday, brought that home. You know, Easter without family, it feels very, very strange to us. So this experience of exile, I thought very well put by Camus. And I think I want to pick out two scenes that happen in the book. So one is a discussion that happens between the main character. Essentially he's a doctor, medical doctor, so he tries to save as many as he can. Bernard Rieu is his name, and he has a friend by the name of Jean Tarou who helps him. And Tarou asks him the question. They actually discuss a sermon in the beginning by a Jesuit priest, and the sermon essentially says, "This is the judgment of God." There is a second sermon by the same priest later where he's a bit milder because he has seen people die up close, and he changes his tone, which is, I think, an excellent observation. And the doctor says it, every country priest who sees people die and sits by their bedside as they die knows more about the reality of what's going on than this scholar who knows a lot of books. I think that was a very valuable observation in itself for me. But as they discussed the sermon, they then turned to the question that goes like this: "Do you believe in God, doctor?" The doctor pauses slightly, Dr. Rieu, and says, "No." "But what does that really mean?" "I'm fumbling in the dark, struggling to make something out, but I've long ceased finding that original." And I think a lot of people feel that way. Well, I don't know whether God exists. I don't really believe he does exist. There are too many open questions. And well, so what? I'm in darkness. I can't really make heads or tail of it and complete sense of it, but that's not unusual. That's just the human condition. And when he explains why he finds it so hard to believe in God, he says in this conversation, "Do you know that there are some who refuse to die? Some people who refuse to die. Have you ever heard a woman scream, 'Never,' with her last gasp?" Well, I have. And when I saw that, I could never get hardened to it. I was young then, and I was outraged by the whole scheme of things, or so I thought. Subsequently, I grew more modest, only I've never managed to get used to seeing people die. This reality of death, I mean, there is this saying that we have, putting it somewhat humorously, all people die, perhaps even me. And this is actually how many of us feel about it. We know it's absurd. We know the death rate is 100% in the end, but we really feel, yeah, all people die. It could even happen to me. Who knows? And of course, we know it does happen to us, but it's not a thought that we enjoy entertaining, and we push it away. And a pandemic like the one we're facing at the moment reminds all of us also of our mortality and the fact that there are so many things we cannot control. The most advanced, industrialized, wealthiest nations of the world, completely helpless in many ways, not completely helpless, thank God, but in many ways helpless. I mean, the British Prime Minister, one of the G7 nations, his life hanging in the balance just this past week, 2 days in intensive care. Very quickly, powerful people come face to face with the fact that they can do very little in the end to prolong their lives. So Camus raises that question. I think what he says practically is terrific to say. What really counts is what we do, how we help people, how we help one another. It's of course also in his case a metaphor for the resistance in France, which Camus joined, and the need to resist the evil, which in his time was actually not an epidemic, but it was the evil of fascism and National Socialism. But he shows as well that the plagues, bad things can bring out the best in people. And we are seeing a lot of that. And we are seeing it in people who are hardened atheists or vague agnostics or people of strong religious convictions of many different kinds. So I find that's true to life. That is what we see. But the question we've been asked to address is, where is God in all of this? And here again, in that same conversation, Dr. Bernard Rieu says the following: since the order of the world is shaped by death, mightn't it be better for God if we refuse to believe in him and struggle with all our might against death without raising our eyes toward heaven, where he sits in silence? So a God who sits up there in heaven and does nothing, sits there in silence, wouldn't it be better not even believing in such a God who does nothing? And actually, I have to agree with him. It would be better if God is just the Almighty God who set it all up and does nothing, is just silent. Then I think I would see very little reason for believing in such a God. But then Stefan hinted already at it. He didn't just hint at it, he made it very plain. As Christians, this is not the kind of God we believe in. And so as the final thought that I want to bring to you before we go into discussions, go to slide.do and enter the code to bring your questions. It's 43332 at sli.do. I want to hear your questions, so that's a little advertisement for the Slido. But before you ask your questions, I want to put that thought to you. What if that festival that millions and billions of Christians observed this last weekend actually is immensely relevant to the situation in which we find ourselves? What if Good Friday, the fact that this wandering preacher, miracle worker, Messiah hangs on the cross means more than just one more innocent victim who suffered a miscarriage of justice and died an excruciatingly painful death, of which millions are happening all the time? What if it is more? What if it is true that it is not only a man who hangs there, but it is God? It is God who took on human form so he could share our suffering, so he could identify himself with the victims of disease and plague, injustice, rape, violence, false accusations, and also of those of us who are burdened with guilt for what we have done to others and what we failed to do for others. What if this is really God who takes into himself this whole suffering and guilt and mess and darkness and sickness and disease of the world, and it breaks his heart and he dies? What if Good Friday shows God has not remained silent, God has not remained inactive? And what follows Good Friday is a day we often don't think about. It's Holy Saturday. Nothing happens there. There's one verse about it in the Bible. They rested because it was commanded to do, they were commanded to do so on the Sabbath. But there, God is silent. Stefan said it beautifully. We don't have answers to all the detailed questions. We can't explain every circumstance. We can't explain why me, why my family, why my grandmother, why my father. There is silence, and we don't know the outcome for our families, for our nations, for the future of the world. We don't know it. So I found this Saturday between Good Friday and what comes next to be hugely relevant to our times. But then, of course, Christianity exists because there was a day after that day. And that many people said, we went there, we found the tomb empty, and we met him. Women experienced it one-on-one, in small groups. Men experienced it a little bit later. That often seems to be the case, my wife tells me. And that was a joke. And so people experience the risen Jesus. And if this is true, if the resurrection really happened, if there really is this life that gives hope beyond the grave, hope beyond death, what if death is not the ultimate word, but the penultimate? What if there is more? Then everything changes. Then there is hope beyond the grave. Then death remains horrible and dreadful and to be resisted and to be avoided and to be mourned and grieved when we lose those We don't have them with us whom we love, but there is a hope that we will see them again. There is a hope that we will live forever because it is given to us as a gift from God. That changes everything. So for me, the big question is, if this story is true, if God became human, if he died on the cross with us and for us and overcame death, if Jesus rose from the dead, then there is a reason for hope that is immense, that carries us through, that speaks to me and you in our deepest suffering, in our personal grief, in our fears, our anxieties about the future, all of which are real, and to none of which there are simple answers. But then there is a hope and a confidence in the future that can carry us. I believe there is. I believe there is good reason to think there is, but I've taken more than my fair share of the time for this introduction. So I yield back to Frauke. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Christian, for this introduction. It's really nice to listen to you both. Meanwhile, I see there's many questions coming up through Slido, which is really nice. And there's two at the tops, and I'm just thinking about which one is the best for your for what you just said. And I just pick one. I said, why doesn't God tell us more about his reason for allowing specific evils in the world?
Thank you for this question. The slight logical problem with the question is, or with me trying to attempt to answer the question, is that I am pretending I know something that even the questioner himself implies only God knows. So, you know, if I knew why God didn't tell us, I would know something that already really, you know, in all honesty, we don't know. So I can speculate, I can tell you, well, why might God not tell us? Well, there are speculations. Well, maybe he's trying to tell us and we're not very good at listening. Or maybe sometimes it's not that why that is the thing that we ought to be focusing on, but rather to what end how can I respond? And I think that's very often the case, that for me, I'd be very interested because I'm curious in why did it happen? But what is actually a lot more relevant to my life is, how should I respond? And I think that's the great wisdom of Camus. He says, well, I don't know the answer, but I know it's right to help those who are suffering. I know it's right to reach out and help my fellow human beings. And so he knows that in his conscience without, in his mind, believing in God. So I agree with his conscience. I believe there's also good reason from my worldview to support it. So in that way, to be the completely honest answer, I don't know why God isn't telling us more. I could imagine that he's trying to sometimes tell us and we're not particularly good at listening. But even more so, I believe he would want us to focus on how we should respond. And there, I think you quoted Chesterton before, and I think it's Chesterton who said, my problem with the Bible are not the things that I do not understand. My problem is with the things I do understand, because they're very hard to do. Love your neighbor like yourself. If somebody slaps you on the cheek, turn the other cheek. Love your enemies. So there are many things we already know. We're not doing them. So why would God tell us even more if we don't even do what we already know? So here you go. See, a theologian can talk for a very long time to say, I don't know.
Well, thank you for that. Well, thank you, Stefan and Christian. We are now switching to all questions. I just saw one question that I find it hard as well. So I thought maybe you know to say, and it's given the record of humanity, why is it worth saving? I don't know if any of you said, I'd like to answer that question. Christian is.
Yeah. I noticed that one, and I thought, what a great question. And I think the great difficulty is with abstraction. We're not saving humanity, we're saving a human being when we work to save people. And again, we can learn that from this terrific atheist, Dr. Rieu. You know, it is the individual whom we can help that counts, where our love is expressed to our neighbor, to the person who is close to us whom we can help. And our neighbor these days can be halfway around the world, because we know that people are dying of malaria or of malnutrition or of so many other things, or they're victims of slavery and human trafficking. We can do a lot. And these days we can do it in the pandemic. So I think saving humanity, all these abstractions, all that goes into the isms, they're very dangerous because they dehumanize and they look at sort of something abstract rather than the individual. And the strongest reason for valuing individuals is, from a Christian perspective, one, they all have inalienable dignity because they're created in the image of God, irrespective of what they've done with their lives, completely irrespective of what they believe or do not believe. They have immeasurable value and worth because they're created in the image of the magnificent, glorious, amazing, awesome God who created the whole universe. They bear his image. And secondly, you can see that value by the price that someone was willing to pay for them. In this case, God was willing to become one of us and undergo the separation from his heavenly Father and the deepest suffering on the cross to make new life, reconciliation possible for all of us. So I think those are huge reasons for us Christians specifically to value each individual. But I think all of us know that in our conscience, if we look around, it's imprinted in us because we are created in the image of God. So I don't know about humanity, but I know about brothers and sisters. I know about my neighbors, and I know I'm called to love them like myself.
Well, thank you.
Maybe I just can add a thought here. I think this whole issue raises the worldview question, and Christian beautifully described the Christian worldview, where we are created in the image of God. But if you raise this question in relationship to a secular worldview, of course, humanity and we individually, we are just one of many of the biological species, and sooner or later we will be extinct like the dinosaurs, and all different species will just disappear. And you will not have this deep motivation for why is humanity generally important and why are you and me important. So it really highlights the whole worldview issue. What kind of world is we part of, and what kind of beings are we as human beings?
Well, I really like you saying that, because here's a question that is asked and like many times, and it compares the Old Testament to now. It says it's common in the Old Testament that God kills people through diseases. For example, well, I don't know what part is it, but somewhere in the Bible. And that does not fit into our modern world. The Western image of God, who is good and who loves us and who has a unique relationship to all of us. And where does it come from, the difference of the Old Testament and the way we look to God now? Because we know that there's one, God is one. He didn't change, but maybe there's a different perspective. Where does it come from? Who likes to answer that question? Christian.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think it's an excellent question, one that I have been thinking about for a while. It relates somewhat also to my research, but I think the key difference already was mentioned by Stefan in his introduction. The difference is whether we're told what's going on or we're not told what's going on. And you actually find cases of that also in the New Testament, so it's not limited to the Old Testament. The difference is, are we being told? Perhaps in some specific circumstances there an explanation is given and says, well, this now is the effect of that. But that's rarely the case. And one thing that happens time and time again, Stefan mentioned the Old Testament book of Job, which the main message of the book of Job is that it's wrong to draw a direct line like that. If you had to reduce it to one message, the one message is there is no direct line between how you live and what happens to you. It just doesn't exist. Jesus makes that point on multiple occasions as well, very clearly, no direct line. So in that way, apart from knowing for certain that God has shown you that this is the cause for that effect, you don't know, and I don't know. And I have to admit, God has not shown me the effect of this cause, nor do I particularly expect him to show me, and I'd be very skeptical of people who are very confident to know the cause. So why doesn't God show us the cause more often? Well, part of it is, again, I think in many ways, we know everything we need to know. All the key facts are there. So it's very simple, if we just begin with the things Jesus said and did, it takes us a lifetime to understand them and to do them. So why provide additional information? It's all there.
Do I say it right when you say we like to comprehend everything and we just cannot?
That is true, but it's not what I've said. But that's okay. She's laughing. She knows it was a joke. It's true. I agree with you. It's not particularly what I said, but we do like to understand everything, but we can't. But I think here the situation is we're not being told, and perhaps one reason is that we actually know enough without any particular special revelation from heaven, dreams, vision, angels appearing. We could just listen to what Jesus said and do it, and we would know enough for a lifetime.
Okay. Well, I'm just running up to the next question. It says, if you don't have a silent God, and we believe this suffering is not his direct will or caused by him, how do we know what is his work in this world and what not? Stefan.
Yeah, thank you very much. Important and complex question. I think we need to have realistic expectations on how much can we understand of God's dealing with the world and with us individually. We are small human beings who live in this specific time slot just now, and we see very little of what has gone before us and what will happen after us. We see reality out from our lives. And if there is an all-knowing God, of course, he has a very, very different perspective. He sees the whole world history, both before us and the future. And it's not reasonable to expect that I will be able, from my perspective, down on earth, limited to this moment, be able to see or understand fully what God is up to. So we need to think through our expectations here. In the Christian faith, God has revealed himself in history, through the scriptures, and of course, above all, in his Son, Jesus Christ. But he has, of course, chosen what to reveal and what to keep for himself. So we have to focus on what God has revealed and what he has said and what we can know. And then we have to just live with the fact that there is so much that we do not know. But if we have reasons to believe that God is a good person, a loving person, a coherent, faithful person, that is not frightening, because what he has revealed about himself gives me confidence that all the things I don't know will actually be more of the same that he has shown me in Jesus Christ. So I'm not afraid of the unknown that he has not revealed to me. So we have to live in faith, but it's not a blind faith. It's based upon a number of things that we do know and have good reasons to trust. And with that as a basis, we trust God also in all those areas where he has not given us so far detailed knowledge or detailed explanations. It's a little bit like marriage, that when you say, yes, I would like my life to be joined with you from this point onwards, you do not know everything about that person, and you do not know the future together with that person. But you can, hopefully, you know enough to have faith, and really good faith, a reasonable faith, to say, yes, I want to be united with you because of what I do know about who you are and our relationship with each other. That would be an analogy to how we can trust God.
Well, thank you. I keep in mind to not have a blind faith, because I think that's very good. And if we get to know more Jesus Christ, it's easier to find out which is from him and which is not. Do I say it correct? Okay, great. Well, the other ones cannot see you, but he's nodding to me. I have a couple more questions, and I'll start with one who's in the top. And it also has, I spoke with it with a lot of friends. It says, what good is there in the current crisis? How can the crisis teach us to live better, more authentic, or more in the image of Christ? And does it go that way? And my friends and I were a little bit skeptical about if we are really able to change and learn good from the crisis. But I hope you are having a more worldview that says, well, we believe people will change from this. So I don't know who to give these questions to, but I don't know. Stefan, would you like to answer this as well?
I can start, and Christian can add to this. Well, in many ways, human beings are the same all over the globe, all through history, before and after tragedies and big events. Human nature with all its greatness and human nature with all its flaws tends to be the same and come through. So I don't think one can have this kind of drastic hope that everything will be changed because of this. But at the same time, the Christian faith, we are not fatalists, that things are just fixed and cannot change. Of course, we can learn from this. And I think this has been and can become really a wake-up call in terms of relationship to God, And I can see in my very secular country that people are writing texts and asking questions about God and the Christian faith in a way they have not been doing for years, because this has really, this epidemic has really hit people. So we see some really interesting changes in that respect. In terms of how we deal with economics, in terms of globalization, in terms of international relationships, I also think it's possible that we can learn, and that hopefully there will be changes in a positive way. So of course we can learn, but it's often a hard and slow and difficult process. Christian.
Yes, I agree that it's hard, slow, difficult process. Now, I think one opportunity, though, as with all opportunities, we don't have to seize it, is to reevaluate, to think about our lives. That's one of the things in this same discussion that I already quoted between Tahu and Rieu. They say, well, but the pandemic, or epidemic in that case, it makes people think. They have to think, they have to pause. And it, in many ways, it does that. Of course, we have Netflix, so we don't have to stop and think. We have there are many other things on offer, and very thought-provoking things on Netflix. So that's not a general comment, but you know what I mean. We can still keep amusing ourselves to death. In the famous phrase, McLuhan, I think, is who said that. So that's still possible, but I think it brings home the fragility of human life, also the value of human life, of relationships, the fact that we can't control everything. So there is potential to actually think. Now, of course, if you are burying a loved one, or if you're fighting for your own life, you will have very different sorts of reflections. If you lose your job, or if the order to stay at home means that you go hungry. Because, there are many day laborers in Peru, in India, many places in the world. If they stay at home for 2 days, they stop eating because they live hand to mouth. So there are, it would be very sort of Western centered to say, well, we have a social system, and, maybe things will change somewhat. But so I wouldn't say it's, a gift to the world. No, it is a terrible, terrible thing with lots and lots of human suffering. But where I sit, I know it does make me reevaluate and think. The much more difficult question is, what happens if things go back to normal? We don't know what the normal will be like, and we don't know when and whether and in what way they will go back to normal. That's the scary bit that we don't like to focus on. But if, say, a year, 2 years, 3 years from now, it's all back to more or less normal, will it produce lasting change? I'm afraid probably history tells against it. I mean, it will change individuals. Whether whole societies will change just because of this, difficult, because you need something to replace the old thing with. And I think that is, obviously, I believe that Christianity is a terrific way of making sense of the world, being realistic, but also very hopeful. And so I think if individuals and societies turn to Jesus Christ and what he stands for, who he is, what he has done, what he teaches, then the change can be enormous. Whether that will happen or not, I hope it will. And we will see.
I hope it will too, actually. And it would be very nice if more people would find hope in Christianity and in Jesus Christ. Well, I have next question, who's also for you, Christian. It says, are you suggesting that Christianity can be viewed as a complicated coping mechanism?
I'm not sure that I was suggesting that, but clearly you were suggesting that, that question, and I'm very happy to entertain that suggestion. I think it's a good one. It's also not an infrequent one. Essentially saying, well, it helps you deal with the fear of death. It helps you deal with the reality that there are things in life you cannot control. I mean, fundamentally, that is precisely what Sigmund Freud, what his most profound analysis of religion in his The Future of an Illusion, 1927. That's what he says. Children, they know they can't control the world. They need the mother and then the father to protect them. They also fear them. As adults, they see we still can't control life. We might die any moment. So they invent themselves gods to protect them, but they also placate them. So I think that's a very interesting theory. And I think if there is no God, it's probably the best theory to explain why people have religion. If there is no God, probably something along Freud is, with some nuances. He was a bit strange in some of his details, but overall, I'd say fair enough. But of course, it presupposes that there is no God, if it is to be the valid explanation. Because if there is a God, well, it would be helpful to cope with life, to know it, especially if he's the kind of God who reveals himself in Jesus Christ, a God who loves me, a God who invites me to come to him and to give my burdens to him because he cares for me, a God who is willing to forgive whenever I mess up, when I sin, when I hurt myself, when I hurt others, when I ignore him, a God who says, I will give you forgiveness and eternal life as a free gift, which you don't have to earn. I have done everything. Now, of course, if that God really exists, and if the story is really true that he became one of us in Jesus Christ, he died for us, he rose again, then, well, it would be helpful to cope. It would be easier to cope knowing that fact to be the case. So it's neither here nor there. Is Christianity very helpful to cope with the world in which we find ourselves? Absolutely. It is terrifically helpful. It provides hope, comfort, strength, orientation, motivation. It is amazingly powerful. It changes lives. It has done so for 2,000 years. Does that mean it's true? Not by itself. Does that mean that it's false, that it's nothing but a coping mechanism? Obviously not. It would be absurd to think that that means therefore it can't be true. You just have to decide the truth apart from the fact that it is extremely helpful. It is extremely helpful. That doesn't make it true. But I think there are many reasons in the history of science, the philosophy of science, in philosophy, various branches of philosophy, in history, in personal experiences, all throughout a cumulative case, that gives us very strong reason to think that it is in fact true, apart from the fact that it is also hugely beneficial.
Okay. Well, thank you. It pops in my mind the text about C.S. Lewis, who is saying about God, that Jesus said he's either a liar, a huge liar, or he was a good man. If he's a good man, he cannot be a liar. And he said, "I'm here to help you." That pops to my mind when you talk about about your answer, your last answer. I have a question that's not in the list, but I'm just wondering, suffering. What does it mean to you? Because we know what it means to the world, but how does it now or in the past affected your life, and where did hope come from at the time? Stefan, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very personal question that all of us listening here can start to think about what has suffering done to us personally. Of course, if I think about my life, I have not, compared to so many other people, met that much of suffering. So a lot of people would be much more, would be much better to really discuss what is the effect of suffering, what can it do to us. I think generally, and I would apply that to my own life too, that suffering can have very different results or effects or consequences for us. Sometimes suffering just makes us bitter. We go down into ourselves and into self-pity and becomes worse as human beings. But the opposite can also happen, that suffering can make us better. So here is a kind of a difference, a huge difference, if suffering makes us bitter or if suffering makes us actually better. That is not to say that we want suffering or search for suffering, but when it happens to us, we have a choice what to do with it. If it becomes a wake-up call, if it creates new clarity in our lives, new priorities, that we can see ourselves and our relationships and our priorities in a new life. And maybe that we can turn to God in a new way we have never done before. So when I think back to my life, I can see both situations where suffering has just been hurting me, and I've not coped with it in a good way. And I can see other situations where suffering, after some time, actually had good fruits, that I benefited from the very difficult situation I went through. And that is, of course, part of the Christian faith, that when you walk with the Lord, you have his promise that if we turn to him, even that which is painful and dark in itself, you can give to him, and over time he can transform it into something that you never could imagine when you were in the midst of it. And that is a beautiful grace when you can see that in your life.
Then I have one more question, because you said I've done both, making it better and making it bitter. Do you have a real example, or is it too personal to ask? Because it might help others to find a way to apply on their lives.
No, I don't have a specific example at this moment, but I think most of us, if you think about your own life, I think you can see the kind of trajectory what suffering can make in your life, of either those two alternatives of becoming bitter or actually becoming better.
Okay. Well, thank you anyway. There's still some questions. Oh, this one is a good one, because since we are all Christians, but there's this guy is saying, why is the Christian God the right God to follow? Could there be many ways to God, or and maybe there's other gods as well? So Why is the Christian God the right God? Christian, it's in your name, so maybe you can answer.
Yes, it is in my name indeed. Well, I think the question is, in one sense, a huge one, because you could say, well, what about all the other religions? Or at least, what about the big religions? What about this or that understanding of God? And how can you possibly, as a very limited, finite human being, be so confident that, the God you believe in just happens to be the right God? That is a very fair, and it's a really big question. I do think there is a very strong answer. Actually, Frauke, you alluded to one way C.S. Lewis tried to answer it beforehand. You said, well, there are not that many options that Jesus leaves you open. Because the kind of things Jesus said, he's either mad, a maniac, crazy, claiming to be this incarnation of God, the God of Israel himself in the flesh, and so on. The sorts of things, we put people into institutions if this is how they talk. But they didn't do it with him. Clearly, they concluded there is something immensely sane, immensely balanced, immensely healthy about that person, Jesus. If he's not insane, then it is possible that he's a deceiver, that he's so clever that he knows how to manipulate people, that he's actually a liar. And he does it, I don't know, because he can, or out of a reason to aggrandize himself and so on. But then if you look at really the outcome of Jesus that he was very aware of and saw coming before anyone else did, namely being crucified and rejected, was not such that any self-serving person would have chosen that route. And then actually what you can't do, so clearly then if he's not mad, he's not bad, could you say, well, he's just a wise teacher, a good person? And that's the thing. Lewis says, no, that he doesn't leave you that option. What the claims he makes, I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Whoever sees me sees God, has seen the Father. I and the Father am one. These kind of claims are either the claims of a mad person or of a deceiver. And if you conclude upon your own study that Jesus is neither mad nor a deceiver, you don't have the option of saying, oh, well, but then he was just, an interesting religious leader. No, then do take him seriously and ask yourself, could he have been right? And if he's right, Christianity stands and falls with the answer to the question, who is Jesus? Is he the Christ? Is he the Messiah? Is he the Messiah of Israel? Is he the Savior of the world? Is he God's Son? Is he God incarnate? If the answer to that question is yes, he is all that, then the God Christians believe in stands out from all the other gods by the fact that he has become one of us in history, that there is historically accessible knowledge about him. There are historical records. There's a huge variety of records, questions you can ask about him and questions you can ask about the resurrection. And again, I alluded to it earlier. The big question is, no historian worth their salt doubts that Jesus Christ, or Jesus of Nazareth, lived and died on a cross under Pontius Pilate. That is fact, undisputed. And we know people die, typically they remain dead. That's also undisputed. That is not special. So Jesus was dead. He was buried. We know that from the records. The question is, did he stay dead, or is it true? Was the tomb empty? Is Easter a reality? Did he rise from the dead? And you can look at that historically. People have written books. I believe Stefan has written about this in his book on the New Testament, whether the New Testament is credible, and I'll turn over to him in a minute. But for me, that's what it boils down to, is what Jesus says credible, and is the resurrection credible? And if Jesus is who he says he is, and if he rose from the dead, that's the answer. That's why we can have confidence that Jesus truly is God incarnate and the way to God. And then it's not he says, she says, or they say. It's not I have more insight than you. I just happen to be persuaded by the person who I believe is the Son of God. And I invite you to look at the same evidence. And it's not just looking at the evidence, but then it's also an invitation to a relationship. So it begins for many people, especially students and academics like ourselves, in the mind. But ultimately, it's also a question of the heart. To I take the risk and say, okay, if this is reasonable, can I make the step and begin this relationship? But Stefan, I mentioned your book. You're a specialist on this. You should also say something, I think.
Thank you, Christian. I think it's so important that we take the whole issue of truth seriously, as Christian said here, and that we are then faced with huge either or. Either there is no God or there is a God. It cannot be simultaneously true that there is no God and there is a God. If there is a God, it's either the God of the Quran or the God of the Bible or another God. So we need to look into the truth issue. Jesus was either an incarnation of the Creator God or he was not. He was either resurrected from the dead or he is still dead. So we need to take the whole issue of truth seriously and see, is it possible to find arguments for that there is a God instead of there being no God, and that it is the God of the Bible, and that the Creator God who worked in Israel, called Abraham, has finally revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ and confirmed that by raising him from the dead. So I think this whole question, in order to answer it, we need to really take truth issues seriously. As Christian said, I've written especially on the reliability of the New Testament, which is, of course, a key part of this search for truth. If you want to investigate into the whole issue, was Jesus the Son of God? Then you are faced with the question, how on earth can we have knowledge about this historical person? And here the whole issue of the reliability of the historical sources about Jesus come into play. So if you have questions about this, I really encourage you to do some work on this. There are excellent materials out there on the reliability of the Gospels and on the identity of Jesus and on the resurrection of Jesus.
Well, thank you for that. Since time is running, I do have one last question, and maybe you can combine it because you also have a closing statement with that. So I'd like an answer of you both. And the question is, could you give us a way of looking ahead and beyond the virus and focus on what is coming after Corona? I see. Okay. I don't know if it's a difficult question, but Stefan, could you start with it?
What is coming after Corona? Of course, I don't know the specifics of how the world will recover from this. Of course, we know it will, in some sense, recover. We don't know the time span and the exact process. But as with other plagues, this will be for a time period, and then things will eventually go back to a more normal situation. And that situation will be a situation where still all the main existential questions will be with us. What on earth are we doing on this planet? Why are we here? Even if there is no plague, what is the meaning of my existence? How should I understand myself as a human being? Why am I here? What's the point of it? Where I'm going, even if I survive the coronavirus, as Christian said earlier, we will all die. So what will that mean for me? All the basic issues of life will still be with us and need to be dealt with. And in light of that, the Christian gospel still stands as such a beautiful option, opportunity, promise that this life is a meaningful life, that there is hope for the human existence, because there is a God who is on our side and has shown that in a historical person of Jesus Christ. So I don't think in the long run the corona virus is changing the basic questions of life. It's not. They are still the same, and the real answers are still there in the good news about Jesus Christ.
Maybe I add a little thing to Christian, because adding to the question is like, then what comes next? But maybe also this time, how can we use it useful? How can we use it to grow instead of just watching Netflix? Since you refer to that, we have so many things. So how can God enrich the meaningfulness of my life, and starting here, but also after Corona?
Yeah, I think that's a good additional angle to the question. I think in terms of what comes next, again, I find Camus actually powerfully moving, because one of the survivors has this sort of reflection to himself. One of his friends that dies. I won't say who's who, so you can read the book for yourself. I won't spoiler it for you. And the other person survives, and he says, but what had he won? No more than the experience of having known plague and remembering it, of having known friendship and remembering it, of knowing affection and being destined one day to remember it. So all a person could win in the conflict between plague and life was knowledge and memories. But if that was what it meant to win the match, how hard it must be to live only with what one knows and what one remembers, cut off from what one hopes for. And I think that every victory over sickness and disease, poverty, famine is only temporary. Every victory that the doctor wins in the hospital is only temporary. The big question remains, in the end, it will be game over. And our life will end. And what if all that remains is memories, knowledge, insight, but no hope beyond? And that's what Camus oftentimes interpreted as the absurdity of human existence. And that, of course, is where faith that has good reasons, faith that is not just a coping mechanism, but actually grounded in reality, that is true, that corresponds to the facts, that is grounded, that that is firm and relates to truth makes such a big difference. So what can we do other than just watching Netflix? Well, one thing I do recommend that you read The Plague by Albert Camus. It will force you to think very hard about suffering. Over several pages, you will read an account of a small child dying a very painful death. And it's good for us because it forces us to be honest and real. The question of suffering is not an easy question. Whether you're a believer or not, it's a very hard question. And we should be thinking about it and face the hardness of it. So you could read, but then beyond that, explore that question. Is there hope beyond the grave? Is there hope and inspiration that goes beyond, that is firm, that is more than make-believe, more than a coping mechanism, more than an illusion? And there are many things that you can do with your mind. And you should be skeptical. Be skeptical by all means. Be skeptical, because a lot of nonsense is being propagated. It's important to be skeptical. Use your mind, use your brain, ask the questions. But then, if you see that actually is strong, I mean, read Stefan's book about the New Testament. Read people like John Lennox, who wrote a book about God in the coronavirus world, about God and science. There are many resources out there. Frauke will say something about it probably at the end, but read. But all these things only give you probabilities. You will see, hey, it's likely, it seems to be true. There are so many reasons. But ultimately, Jesus says, follow me. Trust me. And that's true whether we grew up in a Christian home and have kind of more or less believed all our lives, or whether this is the first time we're actually seriously considering this whole Christian thing. The challenge remains the same. There is a person whom we cannot see, whom we cannot hear with our ears, whom we cannot now touch, who apparently invites us into a relationship. And ultimately, there is an existential act of commitment where I say, yes, I want to get to know you. Yes, I want to know what your love feels like on the inside, what it's like when I follow you. I want to learn to trust you. I want to live my life every day with you. You say forgive. I want to learn to forgive. You say ask for forgiveness. I want to learn to ask for forgiveness. All these kind of things. So there is something, and ultimately, in many ways, that is the key thing that Jesus, if you take him seriously, wants us to do, is to be changed in the way we are on the inside, which always has to have an outflow in the way we act on the outside. Loving God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and loving our neighbor. That's what it boils down to, according to him. So if you've never done that, if you've never entered this relationship, if you have lots of questions, don't take a shortcut. Look for an answer for the questions. But if you know in your heart, that thing seems true, it has the ring of truth, I feel it in my heart, just talk to him, even today. Tell him, I want to know you. Show yourself to me. Read the New Testament, read one of the biographies of Jesus. Maybe Luke or John are good places to start. And then talk to him and say, well, if this is true, show me. If this is true, show yourself to me. And I have the firm conviction that he will, because he promised, whoever asks receives, whoever knocks, to him or her it will be open. Whoever seeks shall find. So there's a firm promise from Jesus. Test him on that promise. You can know him. And all of us can know him better. I want to do it again tomorrow. I want to knock. I will ask. I will seek, because I want to know him better. So I think that's a good way that we can also make use of this time, and any day really of our lives, but also especially in these Corona times.
Well, thank you very much, Christian, for this. For this answer. That's really telling the gospel. I would like you to invite you, and maybe you already did with this last thing, Christian, to have a closing statement, and then I have some practical things. But I want to ask Stefan to share the last thoughts he has for this evening.
Okay, thank you for this evening. Thank you, Christian, for the invitation you just gave to us to search for the Lord. My closing remarks very shortly is that it's so important to compare the alternatives. There are questions that are not answered in the Christian faith, but that in itself is no reason to reject the gospel. You have to compare it with alternatives and see if they have more and better and truer answers. And in my view, you will find out that the alternatives to the Christian faith actually gives you even less answers to your questions and much less hope and meaning. The alternative in God to our culture is the secular worldview with no God, no transcendence, and therefore with very bleak answers to our lives. So if there is no God, we live in the world without meaning and without hope. But if God is there, everything changes. And as Christian said, you have to look into the evidences. It's not a blind faith. Especially, you need to look into the evidences for the resurrection of Christ, the events we have just celebrated in the whole of our culture, that God actually resurrected Jesus. And if that is true, then even with all our unanswered questions, there is really hope for us. There's really love for us. There is really a future for each and every one of us if we accept him, invite him into our lives. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Christian, for you, the same question. Do you have still closer? You said just my last words were the closing already.
Well, I hope they are not my absolutely last words, but see, I made you laugh and it jumped to you. See, the microphone picked up. I made Frauke laugh so hard that he came back on screen. Well, no, I think I've said really what I wanted to say, and I can just say it one more time. There is hope. There is a sure and firm foundation for hope. It withstands critical intellectual scrutiny. You do not have to shut off your brain at any time that you embark on that journey of exploring Christianity and living the Christian faith. On the contrary, you should use it to the best of your ability. But it is not only a matter of the mind, it is a matter of the heart. So that's the great thing. Even people without any education, without access to higher education, without the opportunity to go to school, to read, to study books, even people who are completely disadvantaged have the same ability to access the living God by just saying, God, I want to know you, show yourself to me. But if you can read, you have the great advantage that you can read the historical records of how God showed himself, especially in the life of Jesus Christ. And as your mind becomes persuaded and as your heart is warmed by that love of God that flows into your life, it will also go into your hands. It's a very active thing to follow Jesus. It's not about thinking the right thoughts or having the right feelings. It's a whole way of life. It's integrated, it's beautiful, it's wholesome, it's hopeful. And there is so much hope in it for this world. And you and I, if you are a believer, that's what we are called to be. We are called to be lovers of people who spread love, kindness, hope, truth, and who work for the common good as good members of our societies. So I think it is a great time to continue to follow Jesus or to begin to follow Jesus. Here end the words of Christian.
Well, thank you very much. And I like to thank you all for joining this forum. I at least, and I hope you all had a really good time. And I hope it inspired you guys and gave you new insights. I'd like to thank you, Christian and Stefan. You've done great jobs, and I like all the countries that attended and all the members who were working behind the scenes to make it possible. But yeah, I want to thank you the most, the people who attended and joining us, because without you, it would be just a couple of people talking and conversing with each other. We do have follow up, and it says also in the chat box, so you can read it there. The link, if you don't have it, it's veritasforum.fi/post-attendee. So you can go there, and there are many ways of following up. To everyone, this is my closing actually. Have a great evening, and remember, even though there's suffering in life, there's also hope and faith. We can grab onto that. Much love, and bye-bye.